Before the first scream, Whitechapel was already bleeding through poverty, brothels, and neglect. In 1888, 5 women were butchered on the streets of London. But the deeper crime had begun years earlier. The line lands like a struck match in a windless room. It flares, holds, and shows you where we are. The East End, after midnight, where the wide, respectable boulevards of the West have narrowed into a maze of lanes and courts that feel like an argument with the city itself. Gas lamps stutter. Fog lifts off the Thames like a warning. In the middle distance, somewhere you cannot quite place, a woman's laughter fractures into a cough, then into silence. To understand Jack the Ripper, you don't start with the knife. You start with the ledger, with the price of bread and a bed, with the sound of a belly that hasn't been full in days, with the law that says a woman without rent will sleep outdoors unless she can find a coin by any means the city will not admit out loud. You start with Whitechapel. By the 1880s, the East End had become London's pressure valve and dumping ground. Waves of the desperately poor dock labourers, match girls, costermongers, tailors bent over sweating room benches crashed into rotting tenements that leaned into one another as if conspiring. Behind their bricks, damp, mildew, tuberculosis. In streets like Flower and Dean, Thrall and Dorset, you could smell the rooms from the roadway. The stale boil of clothes never quite dried, bodies never quite washed, a sour note of gin trying to drown it all. Rats navigated the gutters like tacksmen who knew every door by heart. Come daylight, carts rattled past with cabbages, coal and gossip. At night, the district changed register. Public houses blazed golden rectangles across the pavement. Gin palaces winked like temptations, their mirrored bars promising forgetfulness at 3p a glass. The police of H Division walked beats, whose very stones seemed to argue back. And in the alleys behind the blind windows and broken shutters, the unofficial economy of Whitechapel woke up. Prostitution, in theory, was not the crime the city pretended it was. Brothel keeping was illegal, soliciting drew fines, hypocrisy was free. The Contagious Diseases Acts had been repealed a couple of years earlier under a thunder of moral debate that never once lifted rents or opened pantries. So the trade slipped sideways, out of the regulated districts and into common lodging houses and back rooms, up stairwells and under railway arches. Brothels in Whitechapel were often nothing like the crimson-curtained fantasies of West End scandal sheets. They were dingy rooms with a mattress, a chair, and a teacup turned to the wall, a landlady who counted minutes, a girl who split her shillings with every hand that claimed a right to them. Many women didn't have even that. They walked the streets, made quick arrangements in alley mouths, or bought a few hours' shelter in a doss-house bed with the proceeds. 4p for a bed, 3p if the landlord liked your face and believed your promise, a penny to sit up the night in a crowded room where sleep was a rumour and the air was a complaint. In the Spikes the Workhouse casual wards you bought a roof with humiliation and forced labour. So women bargained with dawn and danger. They made choices that were not choices, and Whitechapel witnessed it all without blinking. This was the hidden contour of the brothel as the city knew it. Not only fixed houses of vice, but an everywhere, a movable marketplace of survival. Doorways became brothels. Courts became brothels. The corners of Commercial Street where a woman could catch a man's eye. The open land behind a warehouse. A blind turn-off Hanbury Street brothels. All of them, because the economy had stripped the meaning from the word. You didn't need velvet to make sin. You needed scarcity, and a look the law chose not to see. In this Whitechapel, fallen woman was less a moral category than an economic one. Many who sold sex were widows, abandoned wives, or women cycling in and out of casual labour laundresses, charwomen, hawkers. Some were chronically ill, some were simply exhausted. London's newspapers could smell a story like a dog smells meat, and even before the murders, they floated on steam. Scandal about immorality, sermons in print about brothels corrupting the nation, sentimental sketches of the poor written by men who hired cabs home. Social reformers toured the abyss with clipboards and carefully horrified faces. Police reports catalogued disorderly houses that sprang back under new names as fast as they were shuttered. And all the while, behind the static of moral debate, the math remained. A coin tonight meant a bed tonight. No coin meant rain, a cold step, a dangerous corner. No one with power solved the equation. Listen, a coster cries his wares. A bell from Spitalfields Market rings. Somewhere close a child starts and stops crying as if she is trying not to wake a sister. Farther off, a horse stumbles, and a driver swears by St. Paul and the devil both. It is past midnight now, and the city's respectable heart has turned in. Here, the heart beats on. Whitechapel's streets were not empty of guardians. The Metropolitan Police had men out in all weathers, boots slick with the same sewage as everyone else's. They rousted drunks, broke up brawls, lifted sleeping bodies from doorways, and recorded the 100 tiny tragedies of a district that produced them by the hour. But cuts in force, and the geometry of the slums worked against them. Too many courts that dead, ended without warning. Too many alcoves carved by builders who never imagined they were drafting crimes into the brickwork. Too many people, everyone, always too many. A scream could be a warning or an invitation, or just a song someone didn't know she was singing. Who could tell? And where would you run even if you tried? Step through a door. The stair rises steep with damp. On the second landing, a lodging house keeper doles out blankets that have more history than warmth. In one room, a woman is washing shirts, her hands red with water too cold to do the job, the steam less a comfort than a reminder of what warm should feel like. In another, a man with a cough you can hear through the wall haggles with a landlord over a day's rent arrears. On the third floor, 2 women split a crust and a harsh joke and a bottle of something that will give them courage enough to walk back outside. This is the geography in which Jack the Ripper will move later streets he will treat like a ledger of risk and opportunity. He will not invent the danger here. He will borrow it, exploit it, scale it. He will find women who are alone because the city has organized their aloneness, who are in the dark because the lamps haven't been serviced since yesterday, who are desperate because the week has stretched into a prayer with no answer. He will hunt in a neighborhood that did not need a hunter to be dangerous, and will become famous precisely because, for a few months, the danger will grow a face that the world can describe. But before the murders and the headlines and the myth, there is Whitechapel itself, the brothels that are rooms and roads and opportunities briefly rented, the lodging houses where men and women barter coins for hours of uneasy sleep, the casual wards where shame is policy, the pubs that cash out courage at the bar, the churches and missions that try to paste salvation over systems that will not change. There are also the clubs of immigrants and radicals singing in languages the newspapers cannot print, the match girls who have organized for their lives, the dockers who have tasted solidarity. Hope is here too, thin as the soup and more stubborn. London's East End sits at the empire's throat like a question: how can a city so rich contain a place so poor? The answer is not a mystery. It is a decision written into rents, wages, and the distance between those who set policy and those who pay for it with their bodies. In this gap, 1,000 small predators operate: bullies, pimps, landlords with elastic codes, men in bars with fists they call opinions. And in this same gap, in 1888, a single predator will make himself into a legend. The word brothel will do a lot of work in the story that follows. It will be shouted by moralists and whispered by clients and printed in type that pretends to be scandalized while savoring every syllable. But on these streets it means something plainer: the economy of need, a place where the city's failure to care for its women is converted into a transaction, where privacy is measured in minutes, where risk is included in the price. And because this is so, the brothel spread across Whitechapel like spilled ink will become a stage Jack the Ripper can step onto without rehearsal. He will not have to make an appointment with danger. It keeps office hours here. Outside again. Feel the air. It carries the estuary's damp and the coal smoke's thickness. Somewhere, the bells mark 1 o'clock. A constable's tread comes and goes like a metronome nobody can quite keep time with. On Commercial Street, a woman adjusts the shawl at her throat and watches the doorway of a lodging house where the keeper has told her she is sixpence short. She can find it, she tells herself. She doesn't have to go far. The men are never far at this hour. She will keep to the light. She will not go into the courts. She will not drink with him. She will be careful. She says these things the way a sailor lists the rules that keep a boat upright in weather he cannot change. The historian will tell you that Whitechapel in 1888 was a site of structural violence long before the Ripper cut his first line in flesh. The novelist will say the streets had already learned the habit of fear. The journalist will insist that the social evil thrived in East End brothels because the law was lax. All true and all incomplete. The truth runs deeper into the bricks. A city that condones hunger will always be complicit in the crimes that feed on it. Watch the lamplight ripple across wet cobbles. Hear a door slam where someone has overstayed welcome or credit. A cart rolls past with a broken wheel, and the driver singing to keep himself from sleeping. A cat leaps from a windowsill to a barrel, vanishes. The night would be ordinary if ordinary meant merciful. It does not. It means the same bargain, repeated. Somewhere in the warren of lanes, a woman leans into a doorway with a man who will be generous enough to give her what she needs for the night and nothing more. Somewhere else, another woman says no and is shoved anyway. She will say nothing to the constable because she cannot afford to leave the circle of men who pay. Around the corner, a landlord checks his takings and finds they are just enough to make another day's avarice worthwhile. Up above, in a room that faces a wall, a child sleeps through it all and learns the district's lessons through osmosis. That survival is a choreography you dance without a teacher. That trust is a luxury. That the city loves you the way a fire loves paper. What did the brothels of Whitechapel look like? Rooms with wallpaper, peeled back like scabbed wounds, sheetless beds, a washstand with a jug that hasn't seen clean water since last Tuesday, a fireplace choked with last winter's ash, a window to a yard where someone keeps a pig against the rules, a chair that's been repaired 3 times and will not survive a 4th, a candle stub, a curtain to the hall that used to be a dress, a smell you cannot name that becomes, after a few minutes, the air you will call normal. And alongside all this, the humour that gallows breeds, the kindness the poor give one another when no one is looking, the tiny ritual mercies, a shared heel of bread, a warm spot by the fire offered to a stranger on a brutal night that keep the district from becoming hell without remainder. If you fix a map of the murders over a map of the lodging houses and the common haunts of the unfortunates, you begin to see why Jack chose this hunting ground. He chose it because it made the women he sought visible to him and invisible to the city. Because there were places one could vanish for 5 minutes and find both privacy and no witnesses. Because men came to these alleys to do things the daylight would not tolerate. Because noise was so common that the wrong sort of noise did not travel far. Because fear already lived here and would not be remarked upon if it walked past you, trailing a knife's whisper. We are not yet at Bucks Row or Hanbury Street or Mitre Square. We have not yet knocked on the door of Miller's Court, but the footsteps that will lead us there are already on the pavement. They have been for years. They belong to women who have loved and lost and drunk and sworn and worked until their fingers split, and who will, on certain nights, put a price between themselves and the cold. They belong to men who will pay that price, and to one man who will pay nothing. In 1888, 5 women were butchered on the streets of London, but the deeper crime had begun years earlier. Say it again now, quietly, with the lamps low and the city holding its breath. The deeper crime is the shape of a city that lets some lives slip so far toward the edge that a single shove becomes an afterthought. The deeper crime is hunger turned into a market. The deeper crime is a district that can be used as a stage for horror because it has been used as a backstage for so long that no one expects to see the show. The hour is turning. A damp wind noses along the rows of houses and finds every gap. A constable touches the crown of his helmet, glances down a court, shrugs, moves on. A church clock stumbles over 2 chimes before finding the 3rd. From within a pub, a chorus of voices tries and fails to finish a song together. Out on the pavement, the lights thin. In a handful of weeks, the words Jack the Ripper will make Whitechapel synonymous with fear in every newspaper in the kingdom. Editorialists will discover the East End as if they have discovered a foreign country. Tourists from the West will hire cabs to pass these streets at a roll that feels fast and safe. Reformers will write tracts. Policemen will work themselves to the bone. Detectives will argue their theories in houses that have never known clean air. And the brothels, those rooms and corners and curtained beds that have been here all along, will be rebaptized in ink as if they were born with the knife. For now, there is only the city of shadows and the understanding that something is gathering itself just out of sight. The deeper crime has written its preface in hunger and fog. The first chapter is waiting a few streets away, where the lamps are thinner and the road bears a name that will soon be infamous. Dawn will come up on Bucks Row, and with it, the beginning of what the world will call the Whitechapel murders. If London's West End was a palace, the East End was its cellar forgotten until the smell rose too high to ignore. By 1888, Whitechapel was a place the city tolerated only because it had to, the place where the overflow of humanity was packed tight enough that the rest of London could walk in clean streets and speak of progress. In Whitechapel, progress meant another tenement crammed with the desperate, another lodging house charging 4p a night to sleep in air that made you cough blood, another sewer overflow running down a gutter where children played because they had nowhere else to go. Misery was not an accident here. It was the geography of survival. Imagine the streets by day. Spitalfields Market roars, its wagons piled with vegetables, fish and flowers. The voices rise in competition, a chorus of sellers yelling themselves hoarse. But if you step off Commercial Street, into Flower and Dean, into Dorset, into the courts that bend like crooked fingers, the noise thins and the truth presses close. The houses lean over you, blocking light, their brickwork blackened by coal smoke and neglect. Rooms are divided into half rooms into cubbies, each let to a family or a stranger or both. In some, whole families sleep in corners, while single men rent the centre floor space by the night. Children are born here, live here, die here, without ever seeing more than the narrow lane outside their door. Disease has an address in Whitechapel, and it collects its rent regularly. Typhus, cholera, diphtheria, names that strike fear elsewhere are routine here. In summer, the stench rises as the heat turns the streets into stewpots of rot. In winter, the damp chills every bone. The Board of Works notes the death rates, but does little more than record them. Doctors complain about overcrowding and the breeding of consumption, but remedies cost money, and money is rare here. People cope the only ways they know how, by drinking, by laughing too loudly, by numbing themselves until tomorrow comes and demands another reckoning. It is the women who carry the heaviest burden. Work exists for them, but it is poorly paid and unsteady. They scrub laundry for pennies, stitch shirts until their eyes fail, scrub floors until their backs break, hawk fruit until their voices go hoarse. Even at full stretch, many can barely keep themselves fed, let alone children. And when the day's work does not cover the cost of a bed, there is another way to earn it. Prostitution in Whitechapel is not a trade so much as a last recourse, a bridge between starvation and survival. Some women work in brothels, tolerated so long as they stay quiet, while others walk the streets, selling sex for the price of a loaf of bread or a roof over their heads. They do not think of themselves as sinners or scandal. They think of themselves as hungry. The city thinks of them as expendable. Brothels in Whitechapel take many forms. Some are nothing more than shabby lodging houses with a back room. Some are run by madams who are barely better off than the women they supervise. They are dim, cramped, often filthy. The newspapers speak of dens of vice, as if they are decadent, velvet, draped halls of sin. But in truth they are as bare as the streets outside, and often more dangerous. Violence is common, drunken clients unpredictable, police indifferent. Respectable London pretends to be shocked, but respectable London's men are often the very customers who knock at the doors, pay their shillings, and leave their consciences behind. Children are everywhere in this misery. They run barefoot through streets slick with sewage, their laughter as sharp as it is fleeting. Many will not live past their 5th birthday. Infant mortality in Whitechapel is twice the rate of the West End. Mothers do what they can, feeding babies watered-down milk, rocking them in rooms where the air is heavy with disease, but survival is a lottery no one can rig. The streets are their nursery, the alleys their playground, the markets their school. They grow old before they are 10. Gin is the currency of escape. It is cheaper than food, cheaper than rent, cheaper than hope. Public houses dot every corner, their golden glow promising warmth against the cold. Inside, men drown the memory of 12-hour shifts, and women drink courage enough to walk out into the night. Temperance societies preach reform, but few in Whitechapel have the luxury of abstinence. The police know the drunks by name. They drag them into cells, find them, release them, and see them again the next night. Drunkenness is not vice here. It is anesthesia. Workhouses, the dreaded spikes, are another pillar of East End misery. To enter is to admit failure. Families are torn apart. Men in one ward, women in another, children sent to separate dormitories. The food is meagre, the labour punishing, the shame intentional. Few go willingly. Many choose the streets instead, enduring hunger, rain, and danger rather than submit to the humiliation. The poor law commissioners, safe in their offices, call it deterrence. The people call it cruelty. The East End is also a place of migration. Jews fleeing pogroms in Eastern Europe, Irish escaping famine, country labourers searching for work, they pour into Whitechapel because it is the cheapest place to live and the only one that will take them. They bring with them their languages, their traditions, their resilience, and also the friction of too many cultures crammed into too little space. The newspapers fan suspicion, blaming foreigners for crime, for immorality, for undercutting wages. But the truth is simpler. Everyone here is poor, and poverty does not discriminate. Hunger makes neighbours of all. There are missions and charities. The Salvation Army marches with tambourines, promising salvation alongside soup. Church halls open their doors to the most desperate, offering sermons with their bread. Reformers write pamphlets, host lectures, call for the moral improvement of the poor, but moral improvement does not mend roofs or disinfect wells. The efforts are noble, sometimes sincere, often patronizing, and always inadequate. For every loaf of bread given, a dozen stomachs go empty. For every sermon preached, a dozen women still sell themselves for a night's shelter. Whitechapel by night is a different creature entirely. Gas lamps flicker weakly, their light swallowed by fog. The streets teem with life hawkers selling late-night wares, drunks staggering, women waiting in doorways. Lodging houses fill with bodies pressed together, snoring, coughing, dreaming restless dreams. Brothels do brisk business. Policemen walk their beats, watching, listening, sometimes intervening, often looking away. Danger is constant robberies, fights, assaults, but it is danger that has become ordinary. People live with it the way others live with weather. This is the Whitechapel into which Jack the Ripper will step, a district already saturated with misery, where human life is cheap, where women vanish into alleyways without notice, where the police are overworked, underpaid, and untrusted. The Ripper did not invent Whitechapel's dangers, he exploited them. His knife cut into lives, already frayed by hunger, by cold, by the indifference of a city that had left the East End to rot. The misery of the East End is not a backdrop, it is the foundation. Without the overcrowding, without the brothels, without the women forced into prostitution, Jack would have had no victims, no stage, no legend. His story is not only the story of 5 women butchered, it is the story of thousands ground down by a system that left them with nowhere to fall but into the shadows. The deeper crime was already here, waiting, long before the newspapers christened him the Ripper. And so, as the summer of 1888 drew on, the East End carried on as it always had, crowded, stinking, desperate, half dreaming of relief that never came. No one knew that soon, in the middle of all this misery, a series of murders would take place that would freeze Whitechapel in history forever. But for those who lived there, the terror. If misery was the skeleton of Whitechapel, then its flesh was the women who bore it. They were the most visible and yet the most invisible of the East End, their presence everywhere, their voices rarely heard. In the eyes of polite society, they were simply fallen women, shadows on the cobblestones, nameless figures in shawls and bonnets, drifting from pub to alley, from lodging house to brothel. But behind every face was a story of hunger, of love lost, of children buried, of work that paid too little and days that were too long. Their lives were not accidents, but the arithmetic of poverty sums that never added up, debts that never stopped demanding to be paid. By 1888, there were said to be more than 1,000 prostitutes in Whitechapel alone, though the true number was impossible to count. Many did not think of themselves as prostitutes at all. Some were widows who took in men occasionally to make rent. Others were mothers who sold themselves on nights when the baby's stomach ached with hunger. Some were girls no older than 15, already hardened to the alleyway bargains, already fluent in the whispered exchanges of survival. The word prostitute was too blunt a blade to capture the many shades of desperation. For most it was not a profession but a transaction, a few pennies for bread, for gin, for a place to lay down and forget. A woman's day often began with exhaustion. If she had a bed in a lodging house, she woke cramped beside strangers, the air thick with the sour smells of sweat and damp. If she had not earned enough for a bed, she rose from the cold stones of an alley or from a fourpenny coffin house, where for the price of a coin she had been allowed to sleep sitting upright, slumped over a rope stretched across the room. With dawn came hunger. The markets might provide scraps, the pawnbrokers might take a garment, the streets might offer a halfpenny earned by sweeping a crossing or minding a cart. But more often than not, the arithmetic of survival came back to the same choice: to sell her body, if only for the price of bread. The brothels of Whitechapel were not houses of pleasure, as novels like to imagine. They were practical, shabby, and often indistinguishable from any other lodging house. A single room might serve as both bedroom and workspace, the bed rarely cold, the sheets rarely clean. Some madams controlled half a dozen women, collecting their earnings and offering little protection in return. Others were simply older women renting out rooms and turning a blind eye to what took place inside. Clients ranged from labourers drunk on gin to middle-class men slumming for thrills, the sort who would go home to clean houses and wives who never knew where they had been. Payment was low, sometimes no more than a few pennies, sometimes nothing at all if the man turned violent. For those who walked the streets, the risks multiplied. A woman might stand under a gas lamp on Commercial Street, or lean against the wall of Mitre Square, or wander Dorset Street waiting for a customer. She might earn enough in a night to pay for her lodging and a bite of food, or she might be robbed, beaten, even killed. The police patrolled, but not to protect the women, only to keep the peace, to push them along if they lingered, to arrest them if they caused a scene. Society judged them as immoral, as degraded, but rarely as hungry. Their sins were counted, their needs were not. And yet, for all the misery, there was resilience. These women laughed together, shared bottles of gin, gossiped about customers, watched each other's backs. They found ways to care for one another, even as the city cared little for them. They pawned what little they had, then retrieved it again, cycling their possessions like lifelines. They nursed each other through sicknesses, carried messages, shared beds for warmth. In a world where they were cast aside, they created their own fragile networks of survival. There was also tenderness, though it was fleeting. A client might offer a hot meal, a pair of boots, a kind word. Sometimes, women formed attachments with certain men, trading not just sex but companionship, an illusion of safety in a world of threats. Others clung to memories of past loves, of marriages broken by death or poverty, of children lost to disease or the workhouse. Every woman carried ghosts, and the streets of Whitechapel were crowded not only with the living, but with those memories. The newspapers of the time painted them as dangerous, diseased, morally corrupt. Reformers lectured that prostitution was a sin destroying the fabric of society. Yet the same voices rarely asked what alternatives existed. A woman with no husband, no family, no steady work, and children to feed had choices as narrow as the alleys she walked. If she turned to prostitution, it was not out of luxury, but out of necessity. She sold what she had left her body because no one had given her any other currency to trade. To understand the women Jack the Ripper killed is to see them not only as victims of his knife, but as victims long before he arrived. Each had lived years of struggle before the final terror. They had known the cold indifference of landlords, the sharp hunger of empty stomachs, the humiliation of pawning a wedding ring for bread, the ache of watching children starve. They had known violence, not only from killers in the dark, but from drunken men, from police batons, from the very structure of a society that punished them for existing at the bottom. And yet, they endured. They walked out into foggy nights with heads held high, shawls pulled tight, hearts beating with the faint hope of earning enough to last another day. They were not nameless, not faceless, not the mere shadows that history often reduces them to. They were women of flesh and blood, of laughter and sorrow, of mistakes and resilience. They were the living fabric of Whitechapel, and without them, the story of Jack the Ripper could never have unfolded. The streets knew them, the lodging houses knew them, the brothels knew them, and soon a killer would know them too. His knife would cut deeper than flesh. It would cut into the fragile dignity they clung to, and into the conscience of a city that had let them fall so far. Before the newspapers cried their names, before the police hunted their killer, they had been forgotten. It was only in their deaths that London suddenly looked eastward and pretended to see. For in the end, the life of the fallen women was not about sin or scandal. It was about survival, in a world that offered them no other way. And as the summer of 1888 drew toward autumn, they went on walking, waiting, surviving, never knowing that their struggles were about to become the stuff of legend, sealed in blood on the cobblestones of Whitechapel. Fear rarely comes all at once. It begins like a draught through the cracks of an old door, soft, creeping, barely noticed. In Whitechapel, years before the name Jack the Ripper would ever ink its way across newspapers, the streets already hummed with unease. Danger was not foreign here. It lingered in the corners of taverns, in the hushed tales of the lodging houses, in the heavy footsteps echoing behind women on fog-filled nights. To live in Whitechapel was to live already half in dread, half in resignation. Violence was not an exception. It was the air. Long before the murders, women walking the alleys knew they were never entirely safe. The assaults came suddenly, a shove into the darkness, a hand around the throat, a knife flashed to steal a few pennies. Many attacks went unrecorded. Who would bother to report them? The police seldom listened. The newspapers only stirred when there was spectacle. So the bruises healed in silence, and the whispers spread in shadows. Stories of women found beaten behind taverns, of bodies pulled from the Thames, of nameless figures stumbling home bloodied but alive enough to endure another day. Each story added to the tapestry of dread, but none shocked the city. They were simply part of Whitechapel's rhythm. By the 1880s, superstition and rumour carried nearly as much weight as fact. Lodging house corridors were filled with whispered warnings. Don't walk down Buck's Row after dark. Don't trust the man with the crooked hat. Beware of the stranger who offers gin. Some spoke of ghosts haunting Mitre Square, others of shadowy gangs who preyed on the vulnerable. Fear was a currency, traded freely, passed from mouth to mouth, shaping how women moved through the streets. A single tale of violence could reshape an entire neighborhood's path home. Drunken violence was another constant presence. Gin, cheap and burning, flowed like water. Men stumbled from taverns with fists itching for a target. Women bore the brunt. A refusal to give credit, a misplaced word, even silence could spark a beating. Bruised faces were so common that they became invisible. A woman with a blackened eye was not a mystery. It was simply the mark of survival in the East End. Yet beyond the ordinary brutality, there were whispers of something darker, attacks that were not simply robberies or drunken blows. Women whispered of strange men following them, of being seized and thrown down not for theft, but for some unexplained cruelty. In 1887, a man named Leather Apron began to emerge as a bogeyman. Women claimed he extorted them for money, beat them if they refused. He was said to haunt the brothels, to slash at women with a knife. Police records later suggested Leather Apron was as much legend as reality, but in those darkened streets, rumor was enough. His shadow hung over Whitechapel before Jack's did. The fear fed itself. Each unexplained scream in the night became evidence. Each body found in a ditch became another story, whether or not the truth matched the telling. The lodging houses crackled with speculation. Women who had once endured their nights with resignation began to feel hunted. Even the smallest disturbances carried weight. Scratches on a doorframe, footsteps that stopped when you stopped, the echo of laughter in an empty alley. These were not yet the killings, not yet the frenzy, but they were the prelude, the stage being set. The newspapers, sensing the hunger for dread, amplified it. Headlines warned of East End horrors, of atrocities in Whitechapel. Some were exaggerations, some were inventions, but the effect was real. Middle-class London, reading from the safety of parlours in Bloomsbury and Kensington, began to view Whitechapel as something between a ghetto and a nightmare. The East End became not just a slum, but a place where monsters might roam. This outside gaze deepened the isolation of those who lived there. They were not seen as citizens, but as creatures in a pit, trapped with their own violence. For the women themselves, the fear was practical. It meant avoiding certain streets after dark. It meant clinging to each other, walking in pairs when possible. It meant listening to instinct, that sudden tightening in the chest when a stranger's eyes lingered too long. But survival was cruel. Hunger pushed them back into the alleys, back into the arms of men they did not trust, because coins still mattered more than fear. To eat, to drink, to rent a bed, they were forced to gamble with danger every night. Fear was also changing the men. Customers became more suspicious, less trusted. Every man who stepped from the shadows with coins in hand might be the one who did not want only a quick coupling but something bloodier. Even husbands and lovers found themselves under suspicion. Women whispered, "Could it be one of them? Someone we already know?" In this growing haze of dread, intimacy itself became dangerous, as if tenderness might mask a knife. The police, already mistrusted, were seen as powerless. They patrolled, but not enough. They arrested, but not the right men. Their lanterns might scatter drunks and quiet a fight, but the deeper unease was beyond their reach. For the women, the police were as likely to be oppressors as protectors. Many had been fined or jailed for prostitution, their names recorded in ledgers that marked them as criminals. When they sought help, they were dismissed. And so, the streets belonged not to order, but to whispers. And beneath all of this, something larger was brewing. The city was on edge. Whitechapel, with its brothels, its gin shops, its misery, was ripe for a legend. It was waiting for the spark. In the air hung a sense that something worse was coming, that all the little cruelties, the scattered acts of violence, the rumors of men in shadows were only the beginning of a story that had not yet revealed itself. The first signs of fear, then, were not only in the acts themselves. They were in the way women began to hold themselves differently, the way they checked over their shoulders, the way they laughed nervously in lodging houses to disguise the dread. They were in the tone of the newspapers, in the mutters of the constables, in the shifting glances of men in pubs who suddenly found themselves eyed with suspicion. Fear thickened the fog until Whitechapel itself seemed to breathe uneasily. And in that atmosphere, the killer was already walking. His shadow merged with countless others, his footsteps lost among the crowds. No one yet knew his name. No one yet understood the scale of what was about to unfold. But in the alleys, in the whispers, in the gnawing dread, the story had already begun. Whitechapel was primed for terror. The Ripper did not bring fear into being. He only gave it a face. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols. To history, she would become the first of Jack the Ripper's canonical victims, the beginning of a story that would stain Whitechapel with infamy forever. But before she became a name in newspapers, before she was reduced to a corpse in a dark alley, she was a woman fragile, flawed, resilient, and painfully human. Mary Ann, known as Polly to those around her, was born in 1845, the daughter of a locksmith. She was not born into wealth, nor into the abyss of Whitechapel's slums. Her early years hinted at a modest life, one that might have avoided the abyss entirely had fate been kinder. She married a printer's machinist, William Nichols, in 1864. Together, they had 5 children, a family, a household, a life that in another world might have continued in quiet obscurity. But London in the 19th century was not kind to the poor. The grind of survival wore marriages thin, and Polly's union eventually collapsed. Alcohol played its role. Gin was the friend of many women in the East End, dulling hunger, numbing despair, but also sharpening poverty's claws. After separating from her husband, Polly slipped into instability. She drifted from workhouse to lodging house, sometimes staying with her father, sometimes vanishing for weeks. The streets became her truest home. The pattern was common. Respectability was fragile, easily broken by a few missed rents, a few drunken nights, a quarrel with family. Once a woman fell, the climb back was almost impossible. Workhouses offered survival, but at the cost of dignity. Endless rules, coarse food, lice-filled beds, and the shame of dependency. Brothels, meanwhile, offered a quicker path to coins at the cost of reputation and danger. And so Polly, like so many women, wove between the two, never secure, always one night away from the cold streets. By the summer of 1888, Polly Nichols was 43 years old, though she looked older. Poverty aged the face, deepened the lines, dulled the eyes. Her cheeks carried the flush of alcohol. Her clothes were ragged, patched, stained. She owned little more than what she wore on her back: a bonnet, a shawl, a dress whose hem dragged with grime. On the night of August 30th, she was lodging at Wilmot's, a common lodging house on Thrall Street. To secure a bed required 4 small change to the middle class, but to a woman like Polly, it was a mountain. She had been drinking, and by midnight she had no money left. When asked for her bed fee, she laughed and insisted she would soon return with the coins. "See what a jolly bonnet I've got," she said, showing off her new headwear. It was bravado, the humour of the desperate. And so Polly left the lodging house, stepping into the thick Whitechapel fog. Her aim was clear: to earn enough for her bed, by any means. For women like her, that meant the alleys, the corners, the men who drifted through looking for quick company, sex for a few pennies. Enough for a night's sleep, for another day of survival. The streets that night were restless. Constables patrolled in their slow circuits. Gas lamps flickered in the damp. Carriages clattered on distant cobbles. The pubs had emptied, their patrons spilling into the alleys, voices slurred, laughter sharp. Somewhere, Polly lingered, offering herself, seeking coins. She was seen around 1:30 a.m. by a friend, Emily Holland. Emily recalled Polly was drunk, swaying on her feet. Emily urged her to come back to the lodging house, but Polly shook her head. "I've had my lodging money 3 times today," she muttered bitterly, "but I've spent it." Then she staggered off into the night. It was the last time anyone would speak to her alive. In the early hours of August 31st, Polly was discovered in Bucks Row, a narrow street shrouded in darkness. It was around 3:40 a.m. when a carter named Charles Cross stumbled upon her body. At first, he thought it was a tarpaulin, discarded and useless. But as he stepped closer, the shape resolved into a woman's figure, lying on her back near the stable yard gates. Her skirt was drawn up, her legs straight, her bonnet askew. Cross assumed she was drunk, passed out. He tugged her clothes down to cover her, and continued on his way, not realizing he had touched history. But moments later, another man, Robert Paul, approached. Together, the two realized Polly was not merely drunk. She was cold, too cold. Her hands were motionless. Paul knelt, felt her chest. "I think she's breathing," he said. But the truth was far darker. Constable John Neal soon arrived, lantern in hand. What the men had missed in the dimness, he saw with terrible clarity. Polly Nichols' throat had been cut, slashed deeply twice, nearly to the spine. Blood pooled around her neck, glistening in the lantern light. When Dr. Rhys Llewellyn examined her later, he discovered more. Her abdomen had been savagely ripped open. She had been disemboweled. The killer had worked quickly, silently, in near darkness, and no one had heard a thing. The sight horrified even hardened policemen. This was no ordinary murder. It was not a drunken quarrel or a robbery gone wrong. It was something deliberate, something monstrous. And it had happened in silence, in the heart of Whitechapel, on a night like any other. News spread quickly. By dawn, whispers had become a storm. Another woman murdered in the East End, but this one was different. The throat cutting, the mutilation, these details carried dread. The women of Whitechapel listened, pale-faced, as the story reached them. This was not just danger, this was terror. Polly Nichols was buried on September 6, 1888, in the City of London cemetery. Few attended. Her family had long been estranged, her children scattered, her life reduced to whispers in lodging houses. Yet in her death, she became something larger, the first victim of a figure who would haunt history itself. Jack the Ripper's shadow began with her. And yet, as much as history remembers her as a victim, she was more. She was a child once, a wife, a mother, a woman who laughed, who loved, who fell, who tried to rise. She was human. That is the cruelest truth of Whitechapel. The women who died were not faceless, nameless prostitutes. They were lives, each cut short. Mary Ann Nichols' murder was the spark. Whitechapel's whispers of danger hardened into screams. Fear that had long lingered in shadows now walked boldly in the streets. The women knew something had arrived, something worse than leather apron, worse than drunken fists, something cunning, something merciless, something hungry, and Polly's blood was its first mark. The cobblestones of Buck's Row glistened with damp, the kind of sheen that catches a lantern's glow and returns it in broken fragments. It was the last place Mary Ann Nichols ever saw, though her eyes were already dark when the first witnesses approached. To understand the terror of what happened that night, you must imagine yourself walking those streets in 1888. The gas lamps were faint, their light lost in the fog. The alleys were narrow, claustrophobic, echoing with the shuffle of late-night workers. Whitechapel was a place where every shadow seemed to hold danger, and on that August morning, danger had taken flesh. Charles Cross, the carman on his way to work, was the first. At 3:40 a.m., his boots struck the stones in rhythm, carrying him toward his shift. He thought he saw a bundle of cloth ahead, something discarded, lying oddly against the stable yard gates. When he drew closer, the shape resolved. A woman. She lay flat, her skirt raised, her hands still. For a moment, Cross thought she was drunk. The streets were littered with such figures, sleeping off gin. He tugged her skirts down to restore modesty. The body did not stir. Robert Paul, another carman, soon joined him. Together, they bent over her. Paul thought he felt movement in her chest, a faint breath perhaps. He urged that she be propped up, taken to help, but Cross was less certain. The woman was cold, unnaturally so. Still, neither man saw what the shadows were hiding. Neither man realized that her life had been carved out of her throat. It was Constable John Neal who brought the truth to light. His lantern cut through the darkness, casting a circle of pale yellow upon the seam. The moment the beam caught her neck, the horror revealed itself. Blood pooled black upon the stones. Her throat had been cut twice, deep and deliberate, from left to right. The gashes ran nearly ear to ear, slicing so deep that the vertebrae of her spine were almost exposed. The sight made Neil step back, breath-catching. This was no brawl, no drunken husband's rage. This was precision. When Dr. Rhys Llewellyn arrived minutes later, his trained eyes saw even more. As he knelt by her body, he lifted her skirts. What he found hollowed him. Her abdomen had been slashed open, the flesh carved with deliberate cruelty. A long incision ran downward, exposing organs that should never be seen. Some had been displaced, pulled forward, as though the killer had reached in with purpose. The wounds were fresh, blood was still oozing. Whoever had done this had left only moments before, and yet no one had seen a thing. No one had heard a scream. Buck's Row was bordered by cottages. Stable boys slept only yards away. A slaughterhouse operated nearby, its men accustomed to blood and blades. But on this night, silence held dominion. The killer had worked in darkness, methodical, calm, unseen. He had vanished as easily as the fog itself. The men who discovered her could not reconcile what they saw with the world they knew. Prostitutes were assaulted, yes. They were beaten, sometimes killed in drunken fury. But this was ritual, almost surgical. The cuts were clean, not wild. The abdomen's opening suggested knowledge, anatomical, deliberate. Dr. Llewellyn would later testify that the killer might have been a butcher, or even a man with medical skill. Word spread with frightening speed. By sunrise, whispers carried down Whitechapel's alleys, murmurs at pub counters, hushed voices in lodging houses. Another woman had been killed, but not just killed, carved. The details were too grotesque to be ignored. By morning, newspapers seized upon it. Their headlines screamed of horror in Bucks Row. Readers who had never set foot in the East End devoured every word. Respectable households in Kensington and Westminster read of a throat cut to the spine, a belly ripped open, a monster stalking the poorest women of London. For the women of Whitechapel, it was worse than headlines. It was the confirmation of a fear they had always carried, that the streets they walked for pennies could take more than their dignity. Now, they could take their lives, and not gently, but with unimaginable cruelty. The lodging houses filled with anxious chatter. "Did you hear about Polly Nichols?" someone whispered. "They say her insides were out." Another voice added, "They say it was done with one stroke, like a doctor." The words spread, embellished, repeated until no one could ignore them. The police, too, were unsettled. Inspector Frederick Aberline, newly assigned, walked to the crime scene himself. He examined the narrowness of the street, the nearby cottages, the slaughterhouse, only a stone's throw away. The men there used knives daily, long and sharp, capable of such cuts. The police questioned them, but found no proof. The case, even from the beginning, slipped like smoke through their fingers. At Polly's inquest, the coroner described her wounds in detail, his words echoing through the courtroom. 2 cuts across the throat, the lower severing the windpipe. A long incision to the abdomen, beginning below the sternum. Jagged marks where the knife had moved with deliberate intention. The audience, composed of journalists, locals, and the curious, listened with horrified fascination. Women wept quietly at the back. Men shook their heads in disbelief. The coroner concluded that Polly Nichols had been murdered by a person with knowledge of anatomy, perhaps a butcher, perhaps a slaughterman, perhaps even a medical student. The words carried weight. Suddenly, the killer was not just a brute, but someone educated, skilled, dangerous in ways far beyond fists or bottles. The image of her last moments haunted many. Polly, staggering through the streets in her new bonnet, seeking 4pence for her bed. Perhaps she had met her killer with a smile, or a weary shrug. Perhaps he offered her coins. She followed him into Bucks Row. What happened next was over in moments. Her throat cut first, swiftly, before she could cry out. Then the abdomen, a grotesque display of power, all in silence, all with a confidence that suggested he had done this before or that he would do it again, and he would. The murder of Mary Ann Nichols was not an isolated act of cruelty. It was the opening note in a symphony of terror that would last for months, each act more brutal than the last. But in that moment, no one yet knew. The press speculated, the police investigated, the women whispered, and in the fog that curled through Whitechapel's alleys, a shadow walked unseen, sharpening his blade for the next victim. Bucks Row became infamous overnight. People avoided it after dark, or else walked quickly, eyes darting. Children dared one another to run down it, laughing nervously as they did. The name itself became a reminder. This was where it had begun. This was where Jack the Ripper, though he had not yet earned that name, first struck. Mary Ann Nichols was laid to rest in an unmarked grave. Few mourned her openly. To many, she was just another fallen woman, another casualty of gin and poverty. But the streets remembered, the stones of Bucks Row remembered, and so did the killer. For in his silence, in his precision, in his unspeakable cruelty, he had made a promise, one written not in ink, but in blood. The dawn of September 8, 1888, broke over Whitechapel like a grey shroud. Mist hung low, blurring the gas lamps into ghostly orbs, while the cobblestones, slick from the night's dampness, gleamed like spilled ink. It was a Saturday morning when the markets would soon be alive with hawkers, costermongers, and horse carts, but before the city stirred to commerce, horror had already claimed the streets. Her name was Annie Chapman. She was 47, a woman whose life bore the scars of poverty, illness, and disappointment. Once, she had been married to a respectable coachman in Windsor, raising children in modest comfort, but gin and grief unravelled the fabric of her days. Her marriage dissolved, her children lost one dead of disease, another entrusted to relatives, and Annie drifted eastward to Whitechapel, where so many broken lives converged. In the lodging houses, she was known as Dark Annie. She wore a bonnet that had seen better years, a coat too thin for London's chill, and boots with cracked soles. She sold matches, trinkets, and sometimes herself, her body a last commodity against the hunger gnawing at her belly. Like Mary Ann Nichols before her, Annie's last hours were spent searching for coins, fourpence for a bed, a night's reprieve from the damp and cold. Witnesses saw her in the early morning, weaving between the markets on Hanbury Street. One neighbour recalled her speaking with another woman, despair etched into her face. "It's no use," she said. "I can't get a bed, and it looks as if I shall have to go out." It was the refrain of the East End's women. Go out, find a man, earn a coin, and live another day. Shortly after 5:00 a.m., Annie was spotted standing near 29 Hanbury Street, a lodging house with a small yard behind it. A man was with her. Some said he was dark-haired, foreign-looking, wearing a deerstalker hat. Others could not agree. Witnesses only remembered that Annie's voice was heard clearly in the pre-dawn stillness. "No, not just now," she said. "Maybe some other time." Then footsteps faded, the gates creaked shut, and the yard fell silent. When Mrs. Elizabeth Long, passing along Hanbury Street, glanced at the couple, she thought little of it. The East End was full of such exchanges, business conducted in whispers, women and men bargaining in alleys. But she would later remember that voice, the last trace of Annie before the silence swallowed her. At 6:00 a.m., John Davis, a resident of 29 Hanbury Street, stepped into the yard. The sight that met him froze him to the bone. Against the steps leading to the house lay Annie Chapman, her head thrown back, eyes glazed in the emptiness of death. Blood glistened around her throat, 2 savage cuts carving deep into flesh. Her body had been mutilated with a ferocity that seemed inhuman. Her abdomen was opened wide, organs spilling forth in grotesque exposure. Pieces had been removed, taken an act so deliberate, so purposeful, that it chilled even seasoned policemen. Later examinations confirmed that the killer had taken her uterus with surgical precision. This was not only violence, it was theft of the most intimate and horrifying kind. When Inspector Joseph Chandler arrived, he ordered the yard secured, though curious neighbours pressed close, whispering prayers and curses. The doctor who examined her at the scene, George Bagster Phillips, confirmed what all feared. The murderer had displayed knowledge, perhaps medical, certainly anatomical. The uterus had been excised with skill. No drunkard, no common brute had done this. The Ripper, though he was not yet universally called, that had escalated. What shocked London was not just the brutality, but the calmness with which it had been carried out. The yard backed onto bustling tenements. People had woken early for work. Doors had opened. Voices carried through the thin walls. Yet no one heard a scream. The killer had worked silently, confidently, as though the chaos of Whitechapel itself shielded him. Annie's body was carried away, and an inquest soon followed. There, her life was laid bare for all to hear. A childhood of modest means, a marriage that collapsed under gin, children she could not keep, nights spent wandering for coins. She was not faceless, she was not nameless. She had been a wife, a mother, a woman who once had stability. Poverty had stripped her dignity, and now the knife had taken her life. The newspapers feasted upon it. Sensational headlines screamed of another horrible murder. Sketches of Annie's body circulated, lurid details embellished for circulation. The words monster and butcher clung to the story. The public imagination, once horrified, was now inflamed. What kind of creature disemboweled women in their yards? Who could move unseen in the heart of London and vanish without trace? Whitechapel trembled. Women clutched their shawls tighter, avoided the darkest alleys, and whispered warnings, "Do not go out alone, not at night, not for any price." Yet hunger was relentless. Fear could not buy bread. And so, despite the murders, women still walked into the fog, still offered their bodies for survival, still prayed that the blade would pass them by. The police investigation deepened but yielded little. Witnesses contradicted one another. Descriptions of men seen with Annie were vague, shifting, unreliable. Some spoke of a man in a long coat, others of someone foreign-looking, still others of someone with the air of a tradesman. But the killer was smoke. He left no fingerprints, no footprints, nothing but blood and silence. Inspector Aberline, hardened yet earnest, grew frustrated. He had seen violence in the East End before. He knew of gangs, thugs, and drunken husbands. But this was different. This was ritual. It was escalation. The removal of organs pointed to something far more chilling than rage. A plan. Theories swirled. Was the killer a surgeon, seeking specimens? A butcher from the nearby markets? Or a lunatic with uncanny precision? Dr. Phillips testified that the uterus had been removed cleanly, in a matter of minutes, suggesting knowledge and practice. Yet how could anyone perform such a feat in near darkness, without being seen or heard? The impossibility of it deepened the dread. The funeral of Annie Chapman was quiet, attended by few. She was laid to rest in a common grave, like so many poor of Whitechapel, yet her name echoed far beyond those muddy grounds. She was not remembered simply as another prostitute, another casualty of gin. She became the second in a chain of horrors, the canonical victims, whose deaths marked a turning point in history. For with Annie, the Ripper had revealed his true nature. Mary Ann Nichols had been savagely murdered. Yes, but Annie's death showed escalation, purpose, knowledge. The killer was growing bolder, hungrier. The fear that stalked Whitechapel was no longer abstract. It had a body count, and Annie Chapman's mutilated form stood as its proof. As dawn broke on September 9, the markets of Whitechapel roared back to life. Costermongers shouted their wares, horses clattered, voices argued over prices. Life continued, as it always did in the East End, grinding forward under the weight of poverty. But beneath the noise lay silence. A silence no one could shake, the silence of Annie Chapman's last breath, stolen in the yard of Hanbury Street. And in that silence, the killer waited. By the time Annie Chapman was lowered into her grave, Whitechapel was no longer just a poor quarter of London. It had become a stage of dread. The very cobblestones seemed to whisper that a predator walked among them, unseen, unstoppable. Ordinary noises, a door creaking, a horse's hooves echoing down an alley, the rustle of footsteps in the fog were now laced with terror. For the people of the East End, life had always been a struggle, but now the struggle carried the shadow of death. The newspapers fanned the flames. Every headline screamed of the Whitechapel fiend, the East End horror, ghastly murder. Sensational sketches showed women sprawled in alleys, throats slit, skirts hiked. Rumours circulated faster than facts. The killer was a butcher, a foreign sailor, a deranged doctor. Some even whispered of demons, of Satan himself stalking the streets. The word Ripper was not yet fixed, but London already felt ripped apart by fear. The East Enders themselves were caught between dread and grim fascination. Men gathered in pubs, slamming down pints, arguing theories late into the night. Women clutched shawls tighter, warning daughters not to walk alone. Lodging house keepers whispered about boarders who came and went at strange hours. Yet, despite it all, the desperation of poverty did not change. Women still took to the streets when hunger left them no choice. Every transaction was a gamble with fate. Every alleyway, a potential grave. The police presence swelled. Detectives from Scotland Yard roamed Whitechapel, their bowler hats marking them as outsiders in a world they barely understood. They questioned residents, examined crime scenes, compared notes. But the more they searched, the more elusive the killer seemed. He left no trace. He melted into the East End's labyrinthine alleys, vanishing as if the slums themselves had conspired to hide him. Suspicion fell on anyone who looked different. Foreigners were jeered at, their accents twisted into accusations. Immigrants from Eastern Europe, who had crowded into Whitechapel in search of safety, now found themselves scapegoats. A man carrying a medical bag was followed. Another, with blood on his apron, was chased only to reveal himself a butcher from the markets. The Ripper was everywhere and nowhere. Fear reshaped the rhythm of the city. Streets emptied earlier, brothels closed their shutters. Even the lantern light seemed dimmer, as though London itself recoiled from what lurked in its alleys. In Whitechapel's rotting tenements, women whispered prayers before venturing out, promising to return quickly. Many did not. But it was not only the poor who trembled. The murders forced the wealthier classes of London to peer into a world they usually ignored. The East End had always been a place of others, hidden by distance and disdain. Now its horrors spilled into every newspaper, into parlours and drawing rooms, into the very heart of the empire. The slums could no longer be dismissed as merely unfortunate. They had become terrifying. Illustrated police news printed sketches of Annie Chapman's corpse, lurid and exaggerated, but enough to draw readers' eyes. Gentlemen shook their heads, women gasped, and children sneaked looks at the frightening pictures. A macabre fascination bloomed. What was once hidden behind the veil of class was now public entertainment, horror consumed like a serialized tale. Yet beneath the spectacle, the human cost was unbearable. Mothers were dead. Daughters disappeared. Sisters did not return. The victims were not faceless, fallen women. They were real people whose absence left holes in the fabric of families, however poor, however fragile. Yet society, instead of pity, often cast judgment. Prostitutes, they said, women of the streets, as if that title diminished the cruelty of their end, as if survival had not driven them to that life. The tension thickened like fog. At night, footsteps echoed too loud. At dawn, every shadow seemed longer, every corner darker. The killer, it seemed, was everywhere, watching, waiting. No woman was safe. No home felt secure. And yet, life went on. Hunger could not be reasoned with. Rent collectors did not vanish because of fear. The bells of Whitechapel still rang. The market still opened. And in the alleys, women still bartered their bodies to live another day. But each time they walked into the darkness, they wondered if they would return. It was not simply a murderer haunting Whitechapel. It was an idea that someone could take a life, mutilate a body, and disappear into the mist, untouched, unpunished. It was a reminder that in the East End, lives were cheap, and even in death, dignity was denied. By mid-September, the whispers had become a roar. Whitechapel was gripped not just by the hand of the Ripper, but by the suffocating weight of terror. The city knew it. Something terrible had been unleashed, and it would not stop. And in the nights to come, that truth would be carved deeper in blood. It was the last night of September, 1888. A chill pressed down upon London, damp with mist, the kind of weather that made the lantern flames flicker and the cobblestones sweat. Whitechapel, restless and sleepless, carried on with its routines, hawkers shouting, women huddled for warmth, drunken laughter echoing through the alleys. But that night would prove different. That night, the horror doubled. It would forever be known as the double event. Elizabeth Stride, called Long Liz, wandered the streets of Whitechapel that evening. She was 44, Swedish by birth, hardened by years of misfortune. Her life was a quilt of poverty, failed marriages, and survival by selling her body when nothing else could be earned. She had been drinking, but not heavily, just enough to dull the edges of another weary night. Witnesses later saw her with a man, but descriptions varied. Some said he was respectable looking, others insisted he was foreign, shabbily dressed, with a dark moustache. Whitechapel was a place of too many faces and too much shadow for certainty. At around 1 a.m. in Dutfield's Yard, a narrow passage leading off Berner Street, Stride's life ended. Her throat was cut cleanly, swiftly, but there was something unusual. Unlike the other Ripper victims, she bore no mutilations. Her clothes were undisturbed. Some would later suggest the killer was interrupted, startled by a sudden noise, perhaps by the arrival of a cart rolling into the yard. He had no time to perform the terrible ritual that marked his work. He fled, melting into the darkness, leaving Elizabeth Stride behind her death quick, her fate tragic. But the night was not finished. The killer was not satisfied. Less than an hour later, less than a mile away, Catherine Eddowes, known as Kate, was released from a police cell. She had been arrested earlier that evening for drunkenness, found sprawled in the street, too far gone to stand. By midnight, she had sobered enough to be set free. "Good night, old cock," she cheerfully told the officer as she left. She stepped back into the London night, her boots clattering against the stones, her shawl pulled tight against the cold. She was headed nowhere in particular. Like many in Whitechapel, she lived in the moment, guided by necessity and chance. At 1:45 a.m., Eddowes' body was discovered in Mitre Square, in the City of London. This time, there was no interruption. The killer had time, though, only minutes to do his work, and his work was unspeakable. Catherine's throat was cut deeply, nearly severing her head. Her face was slashed, her eyelids cut, her cheeks carved. Her abdomen was ripped open, her organs mutilated, her womb and kidney taken. It was savagery beyond anything the city police had ever seen. Hardened detectives, men accustomed to the worst, turned away in revulsion. One constable later admitted he could not rid his mind of the image until his dying day. The double event sent shockwaves through London. 2 murders, within an hour, in different police jurisdictions. Scotland Yard and the city police now had to work together, their rivalry sharpened by the killer's audacity. The Ripper had taunted them, striking twice under their noses, slipping away unseen, and then came the chalk. In the early hours, not long after Eddowes was found, a blood-stained piece of her apron was discovered in Golston Street. It lay near a doorway, smeared with human blood and feces. Above it, scrawled in chalk on the wall, were the words, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The message was cryptic, strange, and explosive. In a district crowded with Jewish immigrants, tensions were already high. Riots had flared before. Some officers argued the writing should be left, a clue to the killer's mind. But the police commissioner, Charles Warren, feared an outbreak of anti-Semitic violence. He ordered it erased at once, before daylight. And so it vanished, perhaps the only words the Ripper ever left behind, scrubbed away by caution, leaving only debate in their place. The newspapers seized upon the double event with ferocity. The Times, the Daily Telegraph, the Star, every publication splashed lurid headlines. Illustrations showed shadowy figures looming over helpless women, knives flashing in the dark. The Ripper was no longer just a local terror. He was a national nightmare. Londoners across the city whispered his name, though no one yet knew who he was. The people of Whitechapel, meanwhile, were left to bury their dead. Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, 2 women with different lives, both ending in the same nightmare. They were mothers, daughters, neighbours. Yet too often they were described only as prostitutes, their humanity diminished, their deaths turned into spectacle. But those who knew them grieved, and those who lived on carried the burden of fear. The double event deepened the Ripper's legend. He was not random, he was purposeful, deliberate, and bold enough to kill twice in one night. The city trembled. Women clutched one another tighter. Men looked over their shoulders. Policemen doubled their patrols. And still, the Ripper walked free. For weeks afterward, the alleys whispered. Any sudden noise was enough to send hearts racing. And through it all, the thought lingered. If he could strike twice in one night, what else was he capable of? The terror was no longer confined to Whitechapel. It seeped into the very soul of London. And still, the killer waited, watching, preparing to strike again. The autumn air in London grew colder, but the fear was hotter than ever. After the double event of September 30th, the city reeled in shock. The newspapers were relentless, feeding the public's hunger for detail, speculation, and terror. Every morning brought fresh headlines, and with them, letters. Letters to the police, letters to the press, letters written in red ink or with dramatic signatures, all claiming to be from the killer. Most were obvious hoaxes. The authorities knew this. A killer who stalked silently through the fog and shadows would not waste time scrawling his thoughts for journalists. And yet among the piles of crude forgeries, there were a few that made even seasoned men pause. The first of these surfaced in late September, delivered to the Central News Agency. Written in red ink, in a scrawled, taunting hand, it began with the words, "Dear Boss." The writer mocked the police, laughing at their failure to catch him. He promised to cut off ears, to send them to the authorities as trophies. He signed it with the name that would endure forever, Jack the Ripper. That name, splashed across headlines the next morning, seared itself into history. Before, the killer had been nameless, a shadow, a phantom haunting Whitechapel. Now, he was personified. The newspapers had given him an identity. The public could point a finger at a myth, a legend made flesh, and with a name came fear magnified tenfold. The police were uncertain. Was it genuine? Could a killer so precise, so elusive, also be so reckless as to toy with them in writing? Many dismissed it as the work of a clever journalist, eager to sensationalize and sell papers. But when the double event occurred, something eerie gave the letter weight. The writer had spoken of cutting off ears, and in Mitre Square, Catherine Eddowes' ear had indeed been mutilated. Coincidence or proof? The debate raged. Some detectives insisted the letter must have come from the killer himself. Others believed it was all manipulation, a cruel trick played on a frightened city. Yet the public believed, and belief was more powerful than truth. The Ripper now had a voice. But the most chilling letter of all came weeks later, on October 16th. It arrived in a small brown parcel sent to George Lusk, the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. Lusk was a carpenter by trade, but in these desperate times he had become a community leader, organizing patrols of ordinary men who walked the streets at night with lanterns and sticks, determined to do what the police had failed to do, protect their own. When the package reached him, he opened it to find not only a letter, but something more, something unspeakable. Inside the box lay a small piece of human flesh, pale and gristly. Accompanying it was a note, scrawled in rough handwriting, smeared with misspellings, jagged in tone. It read, "From hell. Mr. Lusk, sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. The other piece I fried and ate. It was very knees. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out, if you only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk." The From Hell letter was unlike the earlier Dear Boss taunt. It was crude, almost childlike in its spelling. But the contents of the package gave it horrifying weight. Medical examination of the kidney revealed it was indeed from a human adult female. The doctors argued over whether it could be linked to Catherine Eddowes, whose kidney had been removed by the killer. Some said it was possible, others doubted it, but possibility was enough. The image was too much to ignore. A murderer dismembering his victim, sending trophies through the post, mocking those who tried to stop him. The press leapt upon it with unholy glee. The From Hell letter became the most famous of them all. To this day, it remains the most haunting artifact of the Ripper case, more than bloodstains, more than witness accounts, more than suspects. Because in those words, we hear not just the crimes, but the cruelty of a mind that relished tormenting the living long after the dead were silent. The people of Whitechapel read about it in the papers, whispering in doorways, clutching shawls tighter against their shoulders. If the killer could take pieces of his victims, cook them, and eat them, what kind of creature was he? Was he human at all? Or was this proof of something darker, a demon clothed in human flesh? The fear twisted into superstition, into whispers of monsters. For the police, the letters created as much chaos as the murders themselves. Scotland Yard and the city police were already rivals, their investigations clashing. Now the press poured fuel on the fire. Detectives found themselves chasing not just a murderer, but shadows of words, taunts and clues that may or may not have been real. Time and manpower were wasted, credibility eroded. Every journalist, every crank, every practical joker wanted to play at being Jack the Ripper. And through it all, the real killer, if he ever wrote a single line, watched and smiled. The letters had another effect. They elevated the case beyond Whitechapel. Before, the murders had been seen by many Londoners as a local tragedy, something happening in the slums, to the poor, to women they did not know. But now the whole country read the words, Jack the Ripper. He was not confined to East End alleys. He haunted the nation's imagination. The murders were not just crimes, but theatre, performed in blood and ink. The From Hell letter, with its fragment of human remains, embodied the terror perfectly. It was a grotesque blending of murder and communication, a voice paired with flesh, a horror made tangible. For George Lusk, who received it, life was never the same. He feared for his safety, suspected he was being followed, believed the Ripper had marked him personally. The very act of opening that parcel changed him forever. In the pubs and gin houses, men argued whether the letters were genuine. Some swore they had the scent of truth, others declared them cheap tricks. Women whispered them as ghost stories to frighten children into obedience. The words became folklore as much as fact, woven into the tapestry of fear that bound Whitechapel tighter with every passing night. And yet, amidst the dread, the truth remained elusive. Were the letters the Ripper's words, or were they the inventions of men who sought only profit and sensation? Did the killer's voice truly echo in those jagged lines, or did silence remain his only true signature, carved in flesh, left on the cobblestones? We may never know. But in 1888, the people of London believed, and belief was enough to make the Ripper larger than life, more phantom than man, more nightmare than killer. The murders were terrible, but the letters, the taunts, the gruesome package, the infamous name, turned the killer into a legend, and as the legend grew, so did the fear. For the people of Whitechapel, it no longer mattered whether the letters were true. What mattered was the knife in the dark, the shadow in the alley, the scream that might erupt at any moment. And with the From Hell letter, one chilling thought took hold. Perhaps the Ripper did not only kill, perhaps he enjoyed feeding on fear itself. By November of 1888, Whitechapel was drowning in fear. The double event had passed. The From Hell letter had circulated, and the streets trembled with tension. Women clutched each other. As they hurried through the alleys, men drank harder and spoke louder in taverns, trying to chase away the unease with gin. But despite the growing terror, life had to continue. Poverty left no choice. Women still walked the streets, selling themselves for pennies to survive another night. And in this grim backdrop stood one woman who would become not just another victim, but the most infamous of all, Mary Jane Kelly. Mary Jane Kelly was different from the other women who had fallen to the knife. She was younger, said to be prettier, more vibrant, with pale skin, striking red hair, and a soft Irish accent. Unlike Annie Chapman or Catherine Eddowes, who carried the lines of age and hardship on their faces, Mary still carried the illusion of youth. But appearances are deceptive. Behind the freshness of her features was the same story of ruin and desperation that haunted countless women in Whitechapel. Her life was a puzzle, pieced together from fragments and rumours. She was born in Ireland sometime in the early 1860s, though some claimed she was Welsh. She had spoken of coming from a respectable family, of having once lived in better circumstances. Some said she had married a man named Davies, a miner, but after his death, her life spiraled downward. She drifted, as so many did, from one city to another, Cardiff, perhaps Paris, and finally London. In Whitechapel, she fell into the same pattern as thousands of others: prostitution, not by choice, but by necessity. Unlike many of the unfortunates, as they were called, Mary often had lodgings. She was living in a small single-room shack at Miller's Court, off Dorset Street. The rent was tiny by middle-class standards, but for Mary, even that was a heavy burden. Her partner, Joseph Barnett, a fish porter, had lived with her for a time, but quarrels had driven him away. She was left alone in her sparse room, with a bed, a fireplace, and a few belongings. On the night of November 8th, 1888, Mary was last seen alive. Witnesses recalled her wandering Dorset Street, looking for clients, her red hair tucked beneath a shawl. Some said she was drunk, her voice slurred, her steps uneven. Others claimed she laughed and chatted as though she had no fear at all. Perhaps she believed, in the privacy of her small room, she was safer than the others who had been murdered in alleys and courtyards. The walls would protect her, but walls mean nothing when the danger walks through the door. That night, neighbors heard her singing. A ballad, they said, a melancholy tune that drifted through the thin walls of Miller's Court. A violet from mother's grave. Her voice was soft, almost childlike, carrying sadness through the air. She sang it over and over again, until around midnight. Then, silence. What happened next is one of the darkest chapters in criminal history. In the morning of November 9th, John McCarthy, her landlord, sent his assistant, Thomas Bowyer, to collect overdue rent. Bowyer knocked, but no answer came. He pushed at the door, but it was locked. Curious, he stepped to the window, where a torn curtain hung in tatters. He peered inside, and what he saw shattered him. Mary Jane Kelly's body lay on the bed, or rather, what remained of it. The Ripper had not merely killed her, he had destroyed her. Her throat was slashed so deeply her head was nearly severed. Her face was mutilated beyond recognition. Her body had been flayed, organs removed, flesh scattered across the room. Portions of her were found on the bedside table, others on the floor, still others placed deliberately beside her. It was not just murder, it was desecration, it was hatred given form. The scene was so horrific that hardened policemen recoiled. Dr. Thomas Bond, who conducted the post-mortem, declared it the worst he had ever seen. Mary Jane Kelly was the only Ripper victim murdered indoors, and in that privacy, the killer had taken his time. Where the others had been slain swiftly, their mutilations completed in haste before discovery, Mary's body was the result of a prolonged frenzy, a slaughter unleashed without fear of interruption. News of her death spread quickly, and with it came a fresh wave of terror. If the Ripper could step into a woman's own home, then nowhere was safe. No locked door, no private room, no sanctuary could keep him out. For the women of Whitechapel, that realization was devastating. The police swarmed Miller's Court, and the press soon followed. Sketches of the crime scene, too horrific for photography, circulated in newspapers. The details leaked: her face hacked beyond recognition, her breasts cut off, her abdomen emptied, her heart missing. London recoiled. Even the most sensational newspapers hesitated to print the full truth. For once, reality was worse than rumor. For historians, Mary Jane Kelly's murder has long raised questions. Was she truly a victim of the same killer as Nichols, Chapman, Eddowes and Stride? Or was her death the work of someone else, a man driven by personal hatred? The differences are stark. Indoors, in a bed, with such extensive mutilation. Yet the similarities, the knife work, the ritualistic butchery, link her unmistakably to the same hand. If the Ripper murdered Mary Kelly, then this was his crescendo, the peak of his horror, and perhaps his end. For after Mary, the murders stopped. Some believe the killer finally quenched his thirst in the destruction of Mary Kelly. Others believe he fled, imprisoned or dead soon after. A few suggest he was never one man at all, but Mary's death, so horrific and final, became the punctuation mark on the terror. But in 1888, the people did not think of theories. They thought only of a young woman, once lively and hopeful, reduced to a ruinous corpse in a tiny room. They thought of her red hair, of her ballad in the night, of her laughter in the gin shops, and they thought of her bed, soaked in blood, a scene that haunted imaginations long after the floor was scrubbed and the room rented again. Mary Jane Kelly became more than a victim. She became a symbol. For some, she was the epitome of innocence destroyed by cruelty. For others, she was a warning, a reminder of what poverty and vice led to. For those in Whitechapel, she was simply one of their own, struck down by a monster no one could stop. Her grave lies in St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Cemetery in Leytonstone. The headstone bears her name, though little else. But her ghost lingers in stories, in whispered tours through Whitechapel, in books and films. More than a century later, she remains the most remembered of the Ripper's victims, not because she was the last, but because the horror of her death transcends time. The gas lamps are long gone. Dorset Street was demolished, its filth replaced with sterile brick. But if you walk there now, some claim you still feel a chill, as if, behind the hum of the modern city, you might still hear the faint echo of a young Irish woman's voice, singing softly into the night, a ballad of loss and sorrow. And perhaps, as the song fades, you hear the silence that followed, a silence broken only by the sound of a door opening, a footstep in the dark, and the arrival of death itself. When Mary Jane Kelly's body was discovered, the entire machinery of law and order in London seemed to grind into motion at once. Detectives, constables, coroners, and doctors were dispatched into the narrow lanes of Whitechapel. For days, Dorset Street swarmed with officials, their heavy boots echoing on the cobblestones. Journalists lurked, sketching and scribbling, eager for every detail they could leak to the hungry public. And yet, for all the appearance of action, the truth was quietly devastating. The police were no closer to catching Jack the Ripper than they had been when Mary Ann Nichols was butchered in Bucks Row. The failures began with the streets themselves. Whitechapel was a maze, an urban labyrinth built by poverty. Alleys twisted and vanished, courts ended in sudden dead walls, and narrow passages funneled criminals into darkness. It was a district designed for disappearance. A man could slip into a side lane, vanish behind a pub, and melt into a crowd of hawkers and beggars in moments. And the Ripper understood this landscape better than the police ever could. Each killing, each escape, played on that geography. Scotland Yard did not lack for officers, but it lacked coordination. Sir Charles Warren, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, had already been under fire for his heavy-handed handling of demonstrations, and the Ripper case only worsened his reputation. Detectives from H Division, based in Whitechapel itself, clashed with officials from the Yard. Information was misplaced, leads ignored, suspects mishandled. The sheer volume of tips, thousands of letters, dozens of confessions, and countless whispered accusations overwhelmed the system. Incompetence was not just an error, it was structural. Consider the Golston Street graffito. On the night of the double event, a piece of chalked writing was found near a bloodied apron discarded by the killer. It read, "The Dewes are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Was it a clue or a distraction? Before careful analysis could be made, Sir Charles Warren ordered it wiped away, fearing anti-Semitic riots. In that single act, perhaps the only written trace connected to the Ripper was lost forever. The investigation was further hampered by the state of forensic science in the 1880s. Fingerprinting was not yet in use. Blood typing had not been discovered. There were no photographs of the crime scenes detailed enough to capture the nuance of the killer's work, only sketches drawn by hand. Autopsies were rushed, conducted by candlelight, with doctors arguing among themselves about whether the mutilations were the work of a surgeon, a butcher, or a lunatic with a steady hand. Each expert contradicted the next, and the uncertainty crippled the inquiry. Then came the problem of suspects. Whitechapel was flooded with them. Foreigners, vagrants, madmen, dock workers, sailors, even respected doctors found themselves under suspicion. Rumors spread like plague. Jewish immigrants were particularly targeted, their unfamiliar customs and languages making them easy scapegoats. At one point, mobs roamed the streets, threatening innocent men whose only crime was to be strangers in a fearful neighborhood. The police interviewed hundreds, detained dozens, and still came up empty. A Polish barber named Aaron Kosminski was whispered about in the shadows, his supposed madness fitting the image of a killer. A barrister named Montague Druitt, whose suicide coincided with the end of the murders, was privately suspected by some. Others pointed to Michael Ostrog, a conman, or Francis Tumblety, a quack doctor with a known hatred of women. Yet evidence was thin, speculative, circumstantial. Each time hope rose, it collapsed. Newspapers fed the frenzy, and in doing so made matters worse. The sensational press of late Victorian London thrived on lurid detail. Every edition carried exaggerated headlines: "Ghastly Murder in Whitechapel," or "Another Woman Slain." The press invented the name Jack the Ripper, branding the killer with a persona that overshadowed the real women he murdered. Letters poured into news offices, some obvious hoaxes, others disturbingly convincing. The infamous Dear Boss letter, which introduced the Ripper's name, and the From Hell letter, sent with a piece of human kidney, inflamed public imagination. Were these from the killer, or frauds designed to sell papers? The answer was never known. For the women of Whitechapel, the failure of the police was a cruel betrayal. Each killing should have spurred protection, yet the streets remained as dangerous as ever. Patrols increased, but so did murders. Women cried out for better lodging houses, for shelter, for some means of safety, but poverty ensured they remained exposed. The authorities seemed more interested in preserving their reputation than in saving lives. When Sir Charles Warren resigned in November 1888, it was too late. Trust had been broken, and so the investigation lurched on, directionless. Policemen trudged through endless interviews. Detectives drew up profiles that led nowhere. Even the supposed involvement of clairvoyants, yes, spiritualists were consulted in desperation, yielded nothing. The Ripper had become a phantom, larger than life, untouchable by law. It is important to remember the climate of London at that time. This was not just about a killer in Whitechapel. It was about class, about gender, about the value of life in the slums. To the wealthy West End, the Ripper murders were grotesque entertainment, a story to follow in the newspapers. To the poor East End, they were a daily terror, lived in real time. The contrast in sympathy was glaring. Middle-class readers were fascinated by the brutality, but rarely pitied the women. Prostitutes were seen as disposable, their deaths treated as inevitable outcomes of their sinful profession. That prejudice infected the police as well. Few in power truly believed the lives of the poor were worth saving. And so, with every failure, the legend grew. Jack the Ripper was no longer a man. He was a myth, a shadow who slipped through hands, who mocked the police, who laughed at Scotland Yard. His killings became theatre, his letters performance, his identity a riddle without an answer. The investigation failed not just in methods but in spirit. The bitter truth is this: the Ripper was never caught. The file remained open for decades, names added, theories scribbled, evidence revisited, but the killer walked away. He melted back into Whitechapel, perhaps a local, perhaps a stranger, perhaps someone who had brushed shoulders with detectives themselves, and the city let him vanish. When the dust settled, what remained was not justice, but memory. The failure of the police became as infamous as the murders themselves, a lesson in incompetence, corruption, and the cold indifference to the lives of the poor. And so, the shadow of the Ripper continued to haunt London, not because of who he was, but because of what he revealed, that, in the heart of the greatest empire on earth, entire classes of people could be butchered, and their killer walk free. The story of Jack the Ripper is told again and again as the tale of 5 women: Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Their names echo across history, repeated in every retelling of the murders, but to focus only on those canonical 5 is to obscure a deeper tragedy. They were not the only women who suffered. Whitechapel was littered with broken bodies, lives cut short, and women whose deaths never made the front page. They were beaten, strangled, drowned, and stabbed, yet their names rarely entered the annals of crime. They were forgotten, erased, not just by the killer, but by the society that failed to see them as worth remembering. Long before Jack's knife carved its way into the alleys, Whitechapel had been devouring women for decades. Poverty created a slow violence, more insidious than murder. Hunger that gnawed at the belly, gin that numbed the body, disease that crippled the lungs. For women with no family, no dowry, and no prospects, prostitution became not a choice but a sentence. A few pence earned in a night meant survival for one more day. Those who sold themselves did so not for pleasure, but because society had left them no other path. They were judged for it, despised for it, and yet depended on it to keep breathing. Every lodging house in Whitechapel echoed with stories of women like these. They huddled in shared beds, their shoes tucked under the straw to keep them from being stolen in the night. They pawned shawls, boots, and even their only dress to buy gin or pay for a bed. When they could not scrape together the pennies, they slept in doorways, on stone steps, or beneath carts. In those exposed hours, many never woke again. Some froze in the damp night air. Some were found with their throats cut, victims of nameless men who vanished back into the alleys without consequence. The press, hungry for sensation, ignored most of them. Newspapers sold when blood was dramatic, when the mutilations were grotesque. But the quiet deaths, the strangled prostitutes left in gutters, merited only a line or two. A woman named Martha Tabram was stabbed 39 times on a stairwell in 1888, just weeks before the Ripper murders began. Her case bore all the signs of the frenzy to come, yet her name was never canonized among the famous victims, perhaps because she was too early, perhaps because she did not fit the narrative the press wanted. In death, as in life, she was overlooked, and there were so many like her. Eliza, found drowned in the Thames. Emma, kicked to death by a client in a darkened court. Dozens of unnamed women whose bodies disappeared into the endless churn of poverty and violence. Their deaths blurred into statistics, their lives barely recorded. They were not murdered by a legend, so history forgot them. Yet their stories are the truest reflection of Whitechapel's reality. Not a handful of killings by one infamous hand, but a constant tide of suffering inflicted on women without protection. The police, too, treated them as forgettable. When the Ripper murders drew headlines, Scotland Yard poured resources into the case. But for the countless other prostitutes slain or beaten, little effort was made. Many cases never had an inquest, never had a detective assigned. Their killers were men of the night drunken clients, abusive partners, strangers who knew they would never face justice. In the eyes of authority, these women were not citizens to be defended. They were fallen women blamed for their fate. This forgetting was more than neglect. It was active erasure. Respectable society liked the idea of 5 victims. It gave the Ripper story a shape, a narrative arc, with a beginning and an end. But to admit that dozens more died in similar ways would unravel the myth. It would show that the violence was not the work of one monster, but the daily reality of a city that consumed the poor. And so, history chose to remember 5, and to forget the rest. But if we pause in those narrow streets of Whitechapel, we can still hear them. The whisper of shoes against cobblestone, the cough of lungs burned by smoke, the murmur of women bargaining for a bed, for a drink, for their lives. Each one had a story, and each one ended too soon. These women were daughters once. Many were mothers. They had laughter, memories, small joys. They were not faceless, but the world has allowed them to fade into shadow. And so, the legend of Jack the Ripper stands on their silence. His myth thrives because their names were erased. The forgotten women of Whitechapel were victims not only of knives and fists, but of indifference. They died in darkness, and history, for the most part, never lit a candle in their memory. If we tell this story fully, we must tell theirs, because in the end, the Ripper was not a singular terror, but the most famous expression of a violence that was always there, waiting in the alleys. And those forgotten women, countless, nameless, voiceless, are the truest ghosts of Whitechapel. Whitechapel's darkness was not only in the knife, nor only in the alleys where women fell. It was woven into the brothels themselves, those dim, hidden rooms where desperation turned into transaction, where survival wore the mask of sin, and where society's hypocrisy thrived. For the brothels of Whitechapel were not simply houses of pleasure. They were the architecture of poverty, the stage upon which the tragedy of the Ripper was prepared long before the first body was found. By 1888, London's East End was swollen with migrants from Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and beyond. Men came chasing work in the docks and factories. Women came because they had nowhere else to go. The city had too many mouths, too few jobs, and no mercy. The brothel, hidden in a back street or dressed up as a lodging house, became the last refuge. For pennies, men could rent a woman's body. For those same pennies, women could buy bread, gin, or a bed for the night. But these houses were not luxurious dens of velvet and perfume. They were narrow rooms with peeling wallpaper, creaking stairs, and a smell of sweat, tobacco, and sickness. Candles burned low, and the windows were nailed shut to keep away prying eyes. Many brothels doubled as gin shops, where intoxication dulled shame. In some, entire families slept under the same leaking roof, children in one corner, their mother in another, whispering to a stranger in the dark. Society condemned them. Newspapers thundered against dens of vice. Ministers preached that prostitution was the devil's lure. Yet those same moralists did nothing to relieve the poverty that drove women there. Worse still, many of the brothel's clients came from the very class that denounced them. Middle-class men, policemen, even wealthy visitors came slumming to Whitechapel for thrills. They crossed the gaslit boundary, sought their desires, and returned home unstained, leaving the women behind to bear both the guilt and the danger. The women themselves were marked twice, first by poverty, which stripped them of choice, second by shame, which stripped them of dignity. Brothels were not places of empowerment but prisons made of flesh. Beatings by pimps and clients were common. Disease spread like fire. Gonorrhea and syphilis were silent killers, untreated and ignored. Women who caught them were discarded, left to die in hospitals or gutters. To be a prostitute in Whitechapel was to live always one breath away from ruin. And yet, within these brothels, life went on. Women shared scraps of food, patched one another's dresses, and nursed each other's wounds. They created a strange kind of family, a solidarity born of suffering. They were not merely victims waiting for the knife. They laughed, sang, and dreamed. Some hoped to leave the life behind. Others accepted it as destiny. Each was human, yet history remembers them mostly as shadows. For Jack the Ripper, these brothels were perfect hunting grounds. The streets teemed with women who could vanish into the night without consequence. A client walking into a room raised no alarm. A woman leaving with a stranger was unremarkable. When one did not return, the world barely blinked. The brothel, meant to provide shelter, instead became the veil behind which murder could strike unseen. But the shadows were deeper still. Police raids on brothels often targeted the women, not the men. The clients were allowed to slip away. Arrests and punishments fell on the desperate, while the respectable walked free. This imbalance gave the Ripper another shield. The women knew they could not trust the law. If they complained, they risked imprisonment themselves. Silence was survival, and silence is what the Ripper relied upon. Even after the murders began, the brothel shadows lingered. Journalists invented lurid tales of women who tempted fate by selling their bodies. Ministers thundered that these deaths were divine punishment. The world chose to see them not as people slaughtered, but as sinners reaping what they sowed. The brothels of Whitechapel gave the killer his victims, but society gave him his cover. And so, when we look back on those blood-soaked months, we must not see only Jack. We must see the rooms with peeling walls, the narrow beds where hunger was traded for moments of intimacy, the women who closed their eyes not for passion but for the price of bread. The brothels were more than buildings. They were tombs disguised as homes, and in their shadows, Jack the Ripper walked freely. To remember the murders without remembering the brothels is to miss the truest horror. Because the brothel was not just a stage, it was the engine of the violence, built by poverty, fueled by indifference, and maintained by society's refusal to care. And when Jack finally came with his knife, Whitechapel was already prepared. The women had been living in the brothel shadows all along. The streets of Whitechapel never forgot. Long after the gas lamps had been replaced by electric light, long after the cobbled alleys had been paved over, long after the rotting tenements had been torn down, there lingered something in the air, a faint shadow, a memory pressed into brick and bone. Those who walked through the narrow passages at night sometimes swore the fog seemed thicker there, that the air hung heavier, that footsteps echoed just a little too close behind. Whitechapel carried its scars not just in the history books but in the bricks themselves, in the stories whispered by those who claimed to hear the faint cry of a woman carried by the wind. The brothels were gone, most of them by the mid-20th century, swept away by redevelopment and official embarrassment. But memory has a stubborn way of surviving. For decades after the murders of 1888, men and women still paused at certain doorways, still glanced uneasily down certain alleys. They remembered the women who had once waited under flickering lamps, clutching shawls tight against the bitter cold, bargaining for pennies to keep themselves alive. They remembered how the city ignored them until their throats were cut, until their lives became fodder for newspapers, until their deaths could be twisted into a grisly spectacle. And in remembering, they kept those women alive in another way, not as nameless, faceless bodies in the night, but as human beings who laughed, wept, dreamed, and suffered. The name Jack the Ripper has never vanished from popular imagination. It has been plastered across book covers, whispered in documentaries, turned into carnival horror and true crime obsession. But Whitechapel itself remembers differently. To the cobblestones and the crumbling bricks, the murders were not a mystery to puzzle over. They were a wound. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, they were women who breathed the same foul-smelling air, who trudged the same mud-choked alleys, who knew the same hunger and the same despair as thousands of others. Their names may now be monuments carved into the record, but in the nights that followed their deaths, they were not legends. They were neighbours, gone too soon, taken too cruelly. For the women who continued to work the streets in the aftermath, memory was not abstract. It was survival. They whispered to each other warnings. They marked the corners where danger seemed thickest. They prayed silently before stepping out into the mist. The fear did not end with Jack's disappearance. The fear remained because the streets themselves remained dangerous, because even without the hand of the Ripper, poverty still stalked every alley, disease still hollowed out bodies, and violence still lurked in drunken shouts from doorways. Whitechapel remembered not simply because of one man's knife, but because the world that had birthed him never truly disappeared. Yet memory is not only horror. The stories of those who lived remind us that there was also resilience. Women shared crusts of bread. Men lifted heavy loads for pennies to feed their families. Children played in the filthy streets and still managed laughter. In the brothels, women formed bonds that were sometimes the only protection they had. They watched out for one another when no one else would. They offered kindness in a world that offered none. The shadow of Jack looms large, but Whitechapel also remembers those who endured, those who survived the fog, the knives, the cruelty, and lived long enough to see the world change, even if only by inches. Today, tourists walk the so-called Ripper tours, led by guides who point out the sites where women died, who tell the grisly tales in rehearsed tones. But if one listens carefully past the sensationalism, past the rehearsed horror, one may still catch the other memory, quieter, more insistent. The streets remember not Jack, but the women. The walls of Mitre Square, the doorway of Hanbury Street, the small room at Miller's Court, they hold not only the echo of crime, but the echo of a life cut short. To stand there is to be reminded that these were once places of living, not merely of dying. The East End has been transformed, yes. Where once were rotting tenements, there are now offices, apartments, shops. But beneath the gloss of the new, the bones of the old city remain. Whitechapel Road still thrums with markets and voices. The pubs still spill their patrons into the night. And in the corners, if one knows how to look, there are fragments of the past. A brick wall that once bordered a yard, a cobbled stretch untouched by modern pavement, a doorway that looks too narrow and too worn for this century. These remnants remind the living that they walk where others walked, breathe where others breathed, and that those others were never only victims in a story, but full human souls. And so, the streets remember. They remember how quickly society forgot its most vulnerable, until blood splashed across headlines. They remember the brothels where desperate women traded their bodies because hunger gave them no other choice. They remember the silence of those in power, the indifference that paved the way for death. But they also remember courage, the courage of women who walked out each night despite the fear, who faced the cold with shawls wrapped thinly around their shoulders, who clung to survival even as the world turned its back. The fog no longer rolls quite the same way over Whitechapel. The gas lamps no longer flicker against damp brick. But if one stands there at night, with the wind curling through the alleys, there is still a chill that feels older than the air. It is the memory of 1888, carried forward not by the killer's legend, but by the stubborn dignity of those who died. The streets whisper their names, and in that whisper, Whitechapel remembers. The story closes then, not with Jack the Ripper, for he was only a shadow that slipped away into the night, but with the women and the streets that held them. London has grown, changed, transformed, but every city keeps its ghosts, and Whitechapel keeps hers still.